We're moving into the IEP structure. So with the IEP structure, we're going to have long-term goals. And again, as I've stated yesterday, and you see it here again, my rule of thumb for a lean and mean IEP, because if an IEP is neither lean nor mean, it tends to be an ineffective document. It's not a very effective roadmap. So I would say that it's probably better to have too few objectives than too many. If you have too few, they're more actionable, and you can solve that problem by teaching the objectives and then getting some new objectives. If you have too many and you're not getting to them, we have a plan that's dead in the water. So you've got your 4 rule of thumb long-term goal areas that you see here, and then you're going to populate under each of those individual umbrellas these short-term objectives. So we're going to get to the short-term later on, but in terms of writing the long-term goals, and you only, really, if you're following this formula, you only have 4 long-term goals that you need to write for your student each year. So when it comes to writing long-term goals, one of the first questions is, what is long-term? What do you mean by long-term? Well, if you think about the short-term goal that we'll get to next, after the first break, the short-term goal is what we want to accomplish in the near future, not even by the end of the year, but maybe by Christmas or by the next reporting period. This is the acute thing that we're working on that will serve the long-term, and the long-term may be the next 2 to 3 years. And often, good advice is imagine 2 to 3 years in the future. Aim high, because we want to have high expectations. One of the things we talked about yesterday. Aim a little bit high, and then your short-term objectives should move you towards that high mark that you've aimed for. So it could be 2 or 3 years into the future, or it might be 5 years or 10 years, depending on where the student is at in their educational program. The image you see there is Dr. Peter Gerhardt, and Dr. Peter Gerhardt is a fabulous behavior analyst and special educator who specializes in working with teenagers and adults on the autism spectrum. And he works on skills that really matter to people's lives, self-determination skills, life skills. And he's a fantastic speaker, and he kind of makes fun of those of us working in early intervention or elementary school education in terms of what do we work on? Because he says, you guys work on all these little things with the young kids, and then I get them when they're teenagers or adults, and there's things you should have been working on years ago, things that are much more important than what you thought was important back in elementary school or even younger than that. So his message is, everyone working in elementary school or younger needs to actually be thinking a lot more about the future and how what you're doing today serves the future, because his specialty is getting those kids around their teenage years, and he's seeing some gaps. So he recommends, this is a recommendation I adopted from him, I endorse this, I now share this widely. Most IEPs that I have influence on in writing will now have the in order to language in the wording of the long-term goal. Back in 2016, the first time I gave a variation of this talk, a number of teachers told me after the fact that this was one of their big takeaways that improved the quality of their IEPs, was just adding in order to, so that you know why this is an important goal. And to be honest, I've been in circumstances at the end of a year where we're looking at an IEP that I was in the initial meeting, and we were all in the initial meeting, and we look at some of the goals, and we're like, what did we mean by that? What were we thinking? It's not clear to us, and we came up with that, which tells us that we had a bad goal or we didn't word it as well as we should have. If you add in order to language, and I'm going to give you a bunch of examples of this, it will help you understand why you're working on this, right? We'll learn this self-determination skill in order to, how does it benefit the student? We'll learn this social skill, right, or these social skills in order to, how does it benefit the student, right? We're always working towards the long-term benefit to the student. So I'll come back to that momentarily. Thinking about transitions, because that was one of the questions at the beginning of the morning, there are natural transitions from elementary to high school or elementary to junior high to high school. And I had the experience a number of times, well, let me back up a little bit. Because I've worked with students longitudinally from K through the end of high school, the first time I had students moving from grade 7 at the end of elementary into grade 8 at the beginning of high school, I would go to the IEP in the first IEP in high school, and what I would notice is the IEP that had been there for the first 8 years of their life, from kindergarten to grade 7, really wasn't on the table, really wasn't referenced. We weren't looking at some of those things and continuing them in high school. We were starting fresh in high school. And sometimes school staff would say to me, you know, most of those things that made sense in elementary school only made sense in elementary school, but we're in high school now. It's a different set of circumstances, a different environment. We know that behavior and learning is contextual, so there's certainly some logic to that. So we need to move forward with a high school IEP. And one of the problems I had with that is thinking, well, I was part of the team over the last 7 or 8 years who put so much time, especially in the most recent years, into what we were working on, and the child was making progress on these things last year, but now we're not working on them this year. So there was no continuity. Goals from elementary school died a natural death. They stayed in elementary school, and they weren't worked on in high school. And the first time this happened, I thought, I just made note of it. Well, that's interesting. And then I noticed that this was a trend, and then I realized that this wasn't just, this was the norm. In many cases, and I've talked to many educators who I work with who acknowledge, yeah, this is often the case. The elementary IEP doesn't move into high school. And that's a bit of a problem because we need to be thinking about continuity of goals. So the punchline of this idea is around grade 5 or 6, if the end of elementary school is grade 7, where I live, you need to be thinking about what high school looks like. So in grade 7, we'll actually often ask to go to the high school that the student will be visiting or will be transitioning to in a year, and we want to go visit it. We want to walk around. We want to get a lay of the land. We want to meet the special education teacher there who will be inheriting our student. Ideally, as the question was asked at the beginning of the morning, have that teacher come to the elementary school and share some information so that all the goals that we develop towards the end of elementary school or before the transition are going to matter and continue into high school. Right? We don't want to see this complete abrupt transition where we just abandon all the things we've been working on for years and start a whole bunch of new things. I don't think that my experience is an exception. I think that that's fairly common. And again, a lot of teachers I've talked to agree with that. So this is just food for thought so that we're thinking about transitions, the big transitions, and making sure that our IEPs are reflective of those transitions. Now, the other big transition, the biggest transition, is when you leave high school. Right? Our students one day will graduate and they will go on, whether they get a grade 13 or not, they're going to leave high school. And so the question I always ask is, how will the goals that we're working on today matter after high school? Right? Or if it's something like doing a literacy activity with Romeo and Juliet, will the student ever need these skills after high school? Will they ever pick up these materials again? Will they ever need this particular math again? And the answer may absolutely be yes, right? If they are going on to post-secondary studies, if that's in their future and this is relevant, it's functional, by all means, it has value. But in many cases, you have to look at what we're doing in high school and think, they probably won't be doing these things after high school. So why are we doing these things in high school? High school, if it's a grade 8 to grade 12, where I live, it's really this 5 years that is a blink of an eye, and then we're off into adult services. And so I often conceptualize high school as a brief period of time where we have resources available that we won't have again to prepare the student for the next 60 years or more of their life. So the question is, how will this goal survive high school? And if we can't answer that in a satisfactory fashion, then perhaps it's not a good goal. And I'll often start by talking to moms and dads around grade 8 or grade 9 early on in high school. Now, you don't do this at the end of high school. You start planning for the end of high school at the beginning of high school. And we'll sit with mom and dad and I'll say, imagine you have a crystal ball. What do you think your son or daughter's future is going to look like when they leave this building? Right? 5 years, 6 years in the future. Are they going to live with you? Are they going to go to university? Are they going to be able to be in the community by themselves? Are they going to be able to engage in leisure activities? Are they going to be able to have a job, even a part-time job or a collection of part-time jobs? We need to start thinking about that so that we know long-term what we're aiming at, and then from there, we reverse engineer back to today. And how do we start working on things today that are going to matter out there after high school ends? As opposed to getting locked into, okay, we're in grade 8 and we just need to think about grade 8, right? We're just stuck in this 1 year. And then next year we'll be in grade 9 and we'll just worry about grade 9. That is not thinking about the future. That's avoiding the future. So this is, again, from my experience working with kids longitudinally and working with them over these transitions, including leaving high school, I have learned these lessons. And sometimes through making errors, being part of the team that has made errors, by looking back and going, we could have done so much more, we could have done so much that was more functional, that would better serve the student. So we need to be thinking about this in advance for future students. That's one of the big punchlines here. Houston, we have a problem. Murray is a grade 12 student. He's described as high functioning on the autism spectrum, but he's not university bound, right? Everyone agrees, including Murray, that he's not doing particularly well in high school, not likely to go on to university. No, he's not interested in going to university. But it is very much appropriate to expect that he will become a taxpayer, and his parents and Murray agree that he can live at least semi-independently. Right? And a taxpayer means if you even work a couple hours a week in a job that pays you even minimum wage, that's real work for real pay. It's not volunteering, it's not charity. And to me, this is, if students, there's a small percentage of students who are going to go on to post-secondary studies, a larger percentage of the students I work with who are going to go into adulthood, and we just want them to become a taxpayer. Even if it's just paying a little bit of taxes, just a little bit of real work for real pay, right? The more the better, but this is what we're aiming for. And everyone agrees that this is okay for Murray. However, you look at his IEP goals. He's in grade 12. IEP goals are highly academic, calculating the circumference of a sphere, identification of possessive pronouns in literature, and they do not match up with adult goals. If you think about it, the things he's being asked to do in his grade 12 classes, he will never be asked to do again. These are only things that matter if you're going into higher education. But Murray, he can't take the bus by himself. And research shows that this is one of the kind of core skills that predict employability in adulthood. If a student is able to ride the bus, that predicts their ability to get a job and keep a job and become a taxpayer. There's zero work placement planned in his grade 12, aside from a few jobs around the school because there's so much pressure and emphasis that he be in class learning how to calculate the circumference of a circle. So here we have a complete lack of connection between what he's doing now and how this matches up to the future. And often we need to, in high schools, be freeing ourselves from some of the kind of conventional parameters that we have to put students in and think about. We might not operate in the context of the usual 80-minute bell schedule. We might need to be going out into the community more because that's where we're going to get the most bang for the buck after high school ends, right? This is a temporary artificial environment, and the purpose of it for everyone is to prepare you for when you leave this environment. How are we doing this for our students, right? So some of you parents, if you've got students in early elementary, you're like, oh my goodness, that seems so far away. That's not relevant now. It'll be here sooner than you think. And even before the high school transition, you've got other transitions coming up. So we really need to be thinking about this. So let me take you through some activities on long-term goals where we're going to look at the conventional wording of, or error wording of long-term goals and think about how we can do this better, because again, our big takeaway for today is not to come up with perfection, but to simply make things better. So a poor long-term goal in academics is that Freddie will learn to read. Right? That really, I would want to know present level, like where is he at right now? Are we starting from scratch? And this doesn't tell you why Freddie would learn to read. How's this functional for him? So here you're going to start to see the in order to language. Freddie will learn to read in order to access information, read for leisure, and access vocational programs after high school. So vocational programs after high school, in the Metro Vancouver area, many post-secondary institutions, universities, colleges, have vocational training programs for adults with developmental disabilities. They tend to have two prerequisites for getting into these programs. One is that you can take the bus to get there. The other is that you can demonstrate roughly a grade 5 literacy level. So the long-term goal here could be that he could pass a grade 5 literacy test. That would allow him to read for information where he needs to. Right? That grade 4 or 5 literacy is pretty functional literacy. That would allow him to read for leisure if that strikes his fancy and that's motivating to him. And it would make sure that it's not a barrier to accessing vocational programs in the future. So now we go from, we'll learn to read, and now I understand the future of this. What is this geared towards? And now keep in mind, this is at the top of this particular umbrella, and under this long-term goal area umbrella, then you'll have short-term objectives that are the immediate instructional steps that you're going to take to work towards this long-term goal. Freddie will demonstrate functional literacy and numeracy skills. Well, what does functional literacy and numeracy skills look like? How are you defining functional? This sounds a little bit better than the previous poorly worded goal, but still, there's something to be desired. Freddie will learn functional literacy skills that allow him to be successful in work settings, and numeracy skills that allow him to manage time and basic shopping. Okay, now I know what we're aiming at. I know what this long-term goal is geared towards, and this is going to have a knock-on effect to the short-term objectives that then can serve the future of this long-term goal, right? This sounds much better. And if you were in the IEP meeting in September and everyone said, yeah, Freddie will demonstrate functional literacy and numeracy skills. That sounds good to everybody. And then at the end of the year, you look at that and go, what did we mean by that? What did we mean by functional? When you put the in order to, you'll never be in that uncomfortable circumstance of wondering really what you meant. And I've been there. By the way, I'm just using Freddie as a blanket example here in homage to B.F. Skinner, Fred Skinner. So Freddie will improve his social skills. Well, that sounds good, right? There needs to be a social long-term goal area for a student who has autism. Freddie will learn social skills in order to establish and maintain peer relationships. So when you have Freddie will improve social skills, we know a lot of the students who we work with are quite comfortable and happy around adults. And why is that? Because adults tend to be a lot more predictable and reliable, right? When you ask something of an adult, they tend to answer you. When you talk to the other little people, they're unreliable and predictable. They don't necessarily respond in predictable ways. And so our students are more likely to interact with adults. If you have Freddie will improve social skills, you might see anecdotally that he is improving some particular social skills in interactions with adults, but the in order to that matters, if this is a young student with autism, is that he is starting to engage with his peers, right? So the in order to here means he can make friends and he can keep friends. And then under that umbrella, the short-term objectives will get really specific about how are we going to go about building this repertoire. Here's another one under social. Freddie will learn to play with friends. Again, what does that look like? What does it mean? We need to get more specific. Freddie will learn to initiate peer interactions, to ask friends to join his play or ask to join their play, and play age-appropriate games with other kids in order to interact with his peers. That's just a whole lot better, isn't it? So it's easy to write bad goals that in and of themselves you're like, yeah, he should learn to play, but it's not good enough. We want to make it better. Adding that in order to language makes it better. Another social example, Freddie will increase his ability to communicate with adults and peers. Again, too vague. Freddie will learn listener and speaker skills in order to have brief conversations with peers at school and staff at work experience. So this is a high school student that you can tell from the wording here, that we want him, because he spends a lot of time in the high school lounge area where all the kids mill about, and some of the other kids come up to him and interact, and sometimes he's motivated to do so, but he lacks the repertoire to do so. So long-term, before he leaves high school, we would like to work on his ability to interact with peers. And this is a student who we want to become a taxpayer. He's not going to university. He's impacted by his autism to such an extent that that is not a realistic expectation. However, he can absolutely work in a variety of different jobs. But to interact successfully at work, you need to at least say hi to your boss or reply to your boss when they say hi. Right? It might not be any more sophisticated than that or demanding than that, but there is some base social skills you need for work experience. And so now we see that that's reflected here. Freddie will increase his language. If you add one word to your repertoire, done, you've increased your language. This is a poorly worded goal. Freddie will learn receptive and expressive communication skills in order to participate in classroom lessons. So now we're looking at language that is related to his receptive and expressive communication for the purpose of being able to participate in the language-heavy classroom environment, right? This makes much more sense. Freddie will use appropriate language. I laugh at this one because it kind of implies that Freddie just goes around swearing at people all the time. This could really be misinterpreted. That's actually not the case for Freddie here. Freddie will learn to ask questions using WH forms, WH questions, to clarify meaning and speak in complete grammatically correct sentences. So this is actually for a student with autism who people would describe as very high functioning, who's just kind of minimalistic or lazy with his language. He can do a lot more than he tends to generate. And so we want to make sure that he's not just kind of using certain tactics to get around speaking more, but that he's using full sentences and he's using them in a grammatically correct fashion. This is also a student with autism who had English as a second language, and part of the grammatically correct could be attributed to learning English as his second language. Here's self-determination. Freddie will learn toileting skills. Okay, that sounds good. That's important. Freddie will learn all aspects of the toileting routine in order to live independently with dignity. Right? Just add the in order to, and then it specifies the value of doing this. It's much clearer to everybody. And now you've got this umbrella of self-determination, and toileting should be at the top of that if the student's not toilet trained. Now you'll have short-term objectives that build towards achieving this functional outcome. Freddie will develop adaptive living skills to increase his independence. Okay, that kind of makes sense. It's still pretty nebulous. Freddie will learn independent skills in order to allow him to be successful at work. Ah, this is better. Now we understand that Freddie is a student who's going to be in high school and he's going to go to work experience, and we want him to have the independent skills so that he can be successful at work. And then the short-term objectives might be things like packing the materials that you need for going to work, having your cell phone and keys and wallet with you, right? Other aspects of getting to work and being successful at work. Freddie will learn to use a schedule as a self-determination goal. Schedules are important. We all have our calendars. Freddie will learn to follow a schedule in order to have predictability in his day and greater independence. And so we know that when Freddie has a schedule, he asks fewer questions about what's happening because he's kind of anxious about what's going on. He doesn't know. It's not predictable. Having that schedule is going to make him a happier, calmer guy because his schedule will be predictable. He can anticipate what's coming. He doesn't have to ask all these questions. He'll be able to make better transitions for himself, and these can all be translated down into the short-term objectives. So that in order to language really works well. So, big take-home message for this section. In your individual education plans and meetings, you will be coming up with long-term goals. In many cases, when you go into your school district meeting, the template for the IEP will already have those areas identified for you. In order to remember why you have good goals, I really strongly encourage you to add in order to language. It has benefited me. Other teachers have told me it has benefited them. I hope the logic of that is kind of apparent from the examples I've just taken you through. A few more ideas around the long-term goals. This is from the National Research Council for looking at autism and IEPs back in 2001. And what the National Research Council recommended is an IEP should have these long-term goal areas. And so I've highlighted in yellow the ones that clearly map on to the 4 rule of thumb long-term goal areas that I've mentioned to you. Right, you've got social, communication, academic, and self-determination. But then you see there's 3 areas that they recommend that are not in the rule of thumbs that I've recommended to you. However, I would argue that they are subsumed in those areas. So engagement and flexibility in developmentally appropriate tasks and play, that's often subsumed in the social skills development. Because if you're playing with other kids, it tends to be social play. Of course, it doesn't have to be social play. Some of our students have to be explicitly taught isolate independent play, and then it is layered up into interactive play with others. Again, if you think about emotional regulation as this big nuanced area unto itself, so is play and the social aspects of play. They are their own curriculum areas, their own universes unto themselves. But in many cases, that will just go into the social skills development. Fine and gross motor skills, that often gets subsumed into the academics because a lot of the fine and gross motor has to do with using scissors and glue and painting and holding a pencil and tracing. So usually those are the motor behaviors that underlie academic behaviors. And so the 4 long-term goal areas that I've recommended as your rule of thumb, don't ignore that, they incorporate it. And then finally, replacement behaviors for problem behavior, absolutely. The problem with problem behaviors isn't that they create inconvenience for others, it's that they create a barrier to learning for the student. And so the motivation to reduce and eliminate problem behaviors is not for the convenience of others, it's to remove that barrier so you can get on with the business of teaching. And so that is often incorporated into what I've advocated for with you thus far as the independence or self-determination. So I'm going to take these items from the National Research Council. We're going to fold them back into the goals that we have. Social skills, communication skills, there you've got that independence. If there's if the student presents with a lot of challenging behavior, it doesn't hurt to have co-labels for that 3rd category. It's independence and behavioral / self-determination. You could be thinking about problem behavior interferes with self-determination, so we don't actually have to have problem behavior in there. Again, lots of students with autism have 0 problem behavior, so it doesn't need to be there for them. And a lot of kids I've worked with, early on there may be challenging behaviors, and as they progress, it's less of an issue, and we just cut it right out of the IEP, and it's truly about independence and self-determination. And then finally, bringing up the rear, last but not least, but last, is academics, and the fine and gross motor can be included in there. I'll often see IEPs that have a 5th long-term goal area that might be motor skills, or a 6th area that breaks it down. That is just up to the whim of the author of the plan. But again, I like to see things that are lean and mean and concise and easily translatable into the classroom. And so integrating, really operating around those 4 seems to make abundant sense to me. But we do have the flexibility, and authors, case managers, you have the flexibility to expand from there if it makes sense for a student. Right? If it makes sense for a student, by all means, go for it.